We have breaking news that in the Russia-Ukraine war, that Ukraine troops have made a new incursion into the Russian territory, this time in the province of Belgorod. This is a little bit to the east of the Kursk offensive, and they have launched another incursion into Russian territory to try and relieve some pressure on the Ukrainians in the Kursk area, as well as other parts of the front. Now, I say this is breaking news. I say that a little bit in jest because it's actually not news at all. It's not surprising at all because this is going to continue on the most recent example of how the Ukraine side has continued to take among the worst operational and tactical decisions that you can imagine in military history. Now, in the West, there's very little appreciation for the operational art of warfare, how things work, how things should work, how they should not work, what's good, what's bad. All they see is what's on the headlines. And if Ukraine takes the fight into Russia, that's good. And if fighting is on the Ukraine territory, that's bad. That's all they think of. If you're taking territory, that's good. If you're giving territory away, that's bad. Problem is, in warfare, those are not always the case. And in this particular situation here, in this war, the Ukraine side has continuously taken the media path forward that gets the best headlines in the West, but that ultimately is helping the Russian side. Check this out. I'm not misstating here. The Ukraine operations have helped the Russian side win the war. And I think when this war is completely over and they go back and they do all the books that are sure to come out about what was going on behind the scenes, one of the big things we'll see is that this series of remarkably bad decisions by the Ukraine side helped lay the foundation for their own defeat. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I'm going to show you on the map, and you're going to be able to see progressively from the first few weeks of the war all the way through to this issue in Belgorod. You're going to see a consistent refusal of the Ukraine side to use the common things of operational art, historically have proven effective, and instead always seek to make a media hit. And unfortunately, while they succeeded on the task at hand to get a media hit, the cost to their forces will be fatal, is how it's going to work out. But first of all, before I get to that, let me bring you up to date on the other issues that are going on, even as we've been since our previous episodes we've done earlier today. And that is on this issue and a move towards a ceasefire. Now, of course, back a week or so ago in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, the United States and the Ukraine side met together to try to come to a unified position that then Trump would be able to take back to Putin, which they agreed, at least on step number one, which was a 30-day full ceasefire. That's what Trump wanted from the Ukraine side. That's what he got. And then he took that to the Russian side. Steve Witkoff went up there just, I think, a day or so later after that Jeddah meeting. And then yesterday was the setup for Trump to actually talk to Putin. Now, at that time, as we've already discovered, I'm sure if you've seen any headlines at all, you know that there was no full ceasefire agreed to. Putin did at least give the Trump side a bone and said, all right, I'll do a 30-day energy infrastructure ceasefire. So for 30 days, we won't fire at the Ukraine infrastructure. They won't fire at ours. And then we'll keep going towards maybe something in the Black Sea. We'll go on to talk about, maybe getting to a full ceasefire, what would have to happen for that. And then, of course, also working towards an eventual end to the war, which is Trump's number one objective. Now, that was yesterday. He talked about the Trump conversation with Putin. Now, today, Trump had a conversation with Zelensky, and Gary was on with Larry Johnson here a little while ago, and we hadn't had the readout at that time. So far, the only thing I've been able to see that Zelensky has said is that he has agreed to abide by what was agreed to by Trump in terms of the no infrastructure attack. Russia has said the same. There was some question whether last night both sides violated it. Don't hold your breath on this one, holding either. But so far, at least he said he was willing to do it, and he's willing to go down the path. And he said he thanked Trump several times, both at the first of the readout and at the end of it. He has learned some lessons from his encounter in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago. But now then, that's the big question is what's going to happen next? Where is this going to go? What leverage does either side have towards compelling the other side to agree to something that's beneficial to their side, et cetera? And that's where a lot of these actions taken by the Ukraine side undermine their position. Now, Russia is obviously in the strong position, which I routinely tell you here, and I don't need to go through all that. It's well established. But when the Ukraine side actually unintentionally undermines itself, that doesn't ever get any attention in the West. And the focus of this deep dive here, I want to show you how. Now, one of the interesting things that Zelensky said earlier in Ukrainian media today was that he says he sees evidence on his northern border, north of the Sumy province, where Russia is massing troops at the border and preparing for new strikes on Ukraine. That's what he said earlier today. And that is not surprising, and that's actually lines up with something we have heard from the Russian side. You may recall just a few days ago when Putin went to Kursk region, when they had made a huge effort at pushing the Ukraine side out of the Kursk province. He went and met with Chief of Staff General Gerasimov and said this.
I very much expect that all combat tasks of our units will certainly be fulfilled, and the territory of the Kursk region will soon be completely liberated from the enemy. Our task in the near future, as soon as possible, is to completely defeat the enemy, who is entrenched and still fighting on the territory of the Kursk region, to completely liberate the territory of the Kursk region and restore the situation on the state border. And, of course, I ask you to consider the creation of a security zone along the state border in the future. I would also like to draw attention to this. All those who are on the territory of the Kursk region, who are committing crimes against the civilian population here, who are opposing our armed forces, law enforcement agencies and special services, are terrorists according to the laws of the Russian Federation. Now Valery Vasilevich Gerasimov has just mentioned the prisoners of war. But these people, of course, must be treated first and foremost as terrorists, in accordance with the laws of the Russian Federation.
So you see, according to Vladimir Putin, he told Gerasimov, let's get ready for an operation to set up a border and a buffer on the Ukraine side of the border. Now, of course, in the Kursk area, that's on the Russian side, and then below that is the Sumy province of Ukraine. So when you hear Zelensky saying he sees a buildup of Russian forces on there, that matches something I've been telling you for quite a number of months, actually, that Zelensky also revealed. It was either January or December, I can't remember which month, where he said he had evidence that there was a massing of about 150,000 total Russian troops in the northern part, north of his border. Now then we see that they're apparently getting closer to Sumy. And of course, Vladimir Putin is not going to tell his chief of staff on television, in public media, to get ready for a clearing operation unless they were already in place. So those two things match up, meaning that there could be a new front opened in the north. And it's unclear how far they would go. He said a border, a buffer. You may recall that about 9 or 10 months ago, Russia said the same thing when in the Belgorod region, they were taking a lot of artillery fire, the city of Belgorod. And so Putin told his troops then, he said, hey, I want you to go set up a buffer there. And that's when they went into the Kharkiv area to push them a little bit further away. But now then, Russian media, as you see there on the screen, is confirming, this is just 2 hours ago, that yes, the Ukraine side is making a penetration, or at least an attempt, into the Belgorod region. Let me show you on the map where we're talking about here, because it's a little bit, okay, if this is the Kursk area, right, this is where they were, and this whole area here is where there had been a lot of the Ukraine, where they, one time went up all the way up into this area, I think, and that's all been collapsed down to now just a couple of fields left over. Well, this right here is the Sumy province. This red line, if you can see it right there, that's the border between the two countries, and this is now on the Ukraine side, already in Sumy, which was done in part to help collapse this pocket to cut off the supplies that were coming in along a road that's about right here. But they haven't left. And now then the question is, how much further are they going to go? So apparently, to try and relieve some of the pressure here, the Ukraine side went into the Belgorod region of Russia, which is basically right here. This is the border between Belgorod and Kursk. Now, if you're having a hard time seeing this on the map, that's not surprising, because let me zoom in a little bit for you here. I got to zoom all the way into here, and you get basically two fields. This is on the Russian side of the border. Again, the red line is the state border between the two. And so this is on the Russian side. Apparently, Ukraine had attempted to penetrate in here to go to this town right here, Demidovka, I believe it's pronounced. They didn't get there. They didn't succeed. And most of the penetration was pushed back. It wouldn't surprise me if by in the morning this has been reestablished back to the border as well. So this is something that is a large problem. As I told you again, when this happened, this offensive operation for the Ukraine side began on August the 6th of last year, and they had a number of things that they claimed that it was going to do, and there were certainly some benefits to the Ukraine side. It wasn't completely pointless, but it wasn't completely pointless tactically, but operationally it was completely pointless because it was never going to change the tide of the war, and it was going to end up costing the Ukraine side a lot of personnel, which they end up doing. They end up losing personnel, they end up losing equipment, and several other things here too. I'm not sure why I seem to have a blank screen here. Hopefully we can figure that out here. There we go. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened with that. So by sending so many thousands of troops into this Kursk operational pocket here, all they ended up doing was diverting very limited resources they had into something that made a big splash at the time. You remember there was all kinds of celebrations going on in the West when this came up, all in the media and European media, the same thing about, sticking it to Putin. It humiliated him. He was embarrassed. You may remember all those kinds of claims. It's going to cause them to divert soldiers around. They had to bring in North Koreans, etc. All those kinds of claims. Well, as it turned out, that while it was indeed an embarrassment for Putin, how could it be otherwise? And while it did cause Russia to have to divert troops, it didn't cause them to divert combat troops from Ukraine. It caused them to divert troops from elsewhere in Russia, where they were already not bothering the Ukraine side. So now then you have a situation to where you have a very finite number of troops on the Ukraine side that were now significant portion of which were diverted into this operation here. And then to maintain the troops in there, they made their penetration, I think, by the 10th day. That's as far as they ever got. And then from that day forward, all of their effort was just on holding what they had. They claimed at the time it was going to be as a negotiating chip to try and cause Russia to have to give up something elsewhere. As I said from the beginning, Russia will never give up anything to get this back. If the attack itself was an embarrassment to Putin, it would be a humiliation and a shame from the Russian perspective for him to negotiate to get that back, as opposed to taking it militarily. So in my view, there was never, ever any prospect that would have that. And so to prove me right on that, the Ukraine side continued to throw away. Some reports are as many as 70,000 dead, an unknown number of wounded, typically triple that number. So it was profoundly costly for the Ukraine side. And now, of course, it's all but effectively gone. And this is not the most recent effort of that. In fact, it continues on. It is a recurring theme that the Ukraine side does. And every time they do these things, they end up harming themselves even more. This goes all the way back to Mariupol. At the very just the first few weeks of the war. Let me go back to my map here. Oh, wrong button here. Let me go back to my map and show you. Let's look at a few things that we have here. First of all, we're going to go back to Mariupol, which is all the way into the eastern part of the country, down around the Black Sea or the Azov Sea. So you may recall this made a lot of news at the beginning of the war. This is Mariupol down here on the sea. And this is where the first time where the Ukraine army fought tenaciously. And in the West, they initially gave them a lot of credit and said they're very brave. And the Azov battalion was here, a lot of the so-called neo-Nazi groups, etc. And they would not surrender. They had a chance. The Russians actually gave them an opportunity, said, we have some routes out of here. We're going to allow you to withdraw. The Ukraine side refused to do that. They said, nope, we're going to continue fighting. And instead, they ended up fighting until they got into this, a lot of the industrial zones there in this area here. And then finally they said, yeah, they took it literally building by building until they finally captured or killed them all. And that was the first sad moment there. Now, let me show you a different map here, because what I want to show you is that this is the first time the Ukraine side made this mistake. When you're fighting tenaciously and you have an enemy that's pressing in on you and they have the superiority where they can force you out, what makes the most sense is that you will make the opponent spend as much as they can on taking this. You'll make it expensive for them to take. You're not just going to hand it over or just leave because there gets to be some pressure, but you want to conduct what's called a fighting withdrawal. And typically what you want to do when you see the situation going, you're going to start building defensive positions somewhere in the depth of that, where it's not in the direct line of sight of the enemy, and you'll build fortifications, rapid fortifications, hasty defense, it's what's called. And you'll be preparing those positions. And then as the enemy gets forced, you'll force him to have to come in, but then you'll do it in a subsequent bounding fashion. So you'll go back to these prepared positions. And then at a certain point, when it becomes untenable, then you'll move back under complete order. And then occupy these new positions. These positions would be built and sited so that there would be large fields of fire, so that the enemy, whenever they're continuing on to try and take you, would have to be vulnerable to long-range artillery strikes, to drones, to rocket fire air strikes if they had much air power at the time, and those things. That's what should have been done. Now, many people argued, who don't really understand military formations, they say, well, you can't just give the city away because that's the whole thing. You're trying to hold on to the towns. But my argument is that no, militarily, sometimes you do have to give away the city, as long as you do it the way I described, which is try to make it expensive for the enemy, but then make sure that you have the ability to withdraw under order so that you move back to reinforced positions. And now then, once the enemy has his position, for them to move up to your next position, you can extract a much higher death toll on their soldiers and make it more expensive for them to move to the next position. Because in a war of attrition, folks, it's not about just the territory that you have, but it's about the viability of your armed forces. And so in this particular case, and now then let me go to a different map here, because this one is going to show you what the situation was at the time. That what picture I just showed you right there was that's kind of where it is right now, where you can see a lot of the where the Russians are now. It's all red. This is the map that was at the time they were in there in March and April of 2022. This is Mariupol right here. So you see, these are the areas that the Russians had. So there was plenty of room for the Ukraine side. This is what the white area here is what the Ukraine had control over. This is early in the war. So there was an opportunity for the Ukraine side to withdraw their forces while they still had them intact, and then they would be able to provide a better security position from here. And if they needed to fall back, and of course, as you know, from looking at the map I just showed you, this all ended up turning red here. So they would have continued to fall back. Here's the thing. By not doing that, by not taking the action that makes the most military sense, they ended up losing that entire battle group. And of course, early in the war, that was a group that had among the most combat experience. They had the most training because, they had been fighting a low-level war, a low-level civil war for 8 years prior to this. They had been getting lots of NATO training. And so all of those guys were among the most trained at every level, from the leader level at each echelon all the way down to the lower troops. If they had withdrawn them from Mariupol before the city was wrested from their hands building by building, then they would have been able to take that force and continue to expand it. As they did more mobilization come in, they could have trained more people, spread the trained leaders out to others, so every organization then becomes more combat capable. That's what they would have done if it made sense. By saying, no, we're not going to give this city up, they lost all of those troops and they lost the city. That was one of the big problems with this philosophy here. It looks good on paper, and it plays well to the emotion and the heartstrings of those who are pulling for you, because it is great. It was a lot of courage, and they did fight fiercely, and it took the Russians a long time to take the city. It was expensive for the Russians to take the city. It wasn't cheap, but it's not as expensive for the Russian forces as if they would have had to then attack over open terrain that would have given the firepower advantage to the defending Ukrainians. So it was even though they were heroic and lauded, etc., it was a definite loss for the Ukraine side in every way. It was not to be the last. Then, of course, we have the situation with Bakhmut. That was probably one of the more famous ones, where that was a long fight. We had Evgeny Prigozhin. You may recall that was a long fight that took place. Let's see, let me find out where I'm at on the map here. Bakhmut. This is an area. So the Russians were coming in from the east to the west. And you may recall that the city of Bakhmut here had to be taken almost street by street, very often house by house. It took, I want to say, 9 months for the Russians to take. But this was the next big issue here. Now, you can see here from this depiction here that there was lots of fortifications that the Ukraine side had. These were never taken off. So there was plenty of fortifications around here. There's some up here, and you see they still have some on their side of the line now. If the Ukraine side was doing the wise things, because these were the leading fortifications at the time that the Ukraine side has. So as the Russians were coming up, they had to break through these. And you see, to get to these, they had to go across a lot of open area. There was also lots of high-rise buildings here. So Ukraine had a very strong read about where they could, like a fortress. So it was going to be expensive for the Russians to take. But once Russia made it through these areas and then got into the outskirts of the town here, now from this point forward, it's no longer tenable to hold the city for the Ukraine side, because now then, whereas with the Ukraine side, this was their front line in this area here, and the Russians are coming from here, they had to go across these wide open fields where they can be seen, and they died in large numbers. But once they get into here, now all of a sudden, instead of, a kilometer, 3 kilometers of visibility where you can take them under long range, now it's the building next to you. So now then the Russians can get right up to your position where they can attack and destroy you. And so they have cover and concealment to where they can bring up. And so it's a lot easier for the attacking force when they have all this cover to go to. What the Ukraine side should have done is to withdraw under pressure or under order, so that they could move back to these other defensive positions where, again, they would have set up to where they had long fields of fire to where they could extract a heavy toll on the Russians. And then they should have built additional lines behind that and so forth where they would bound back to them. The point was going to be that they're going to have to attrit the Russian forces while only giving ground under pressure. So they certainly didn't want to just get into a withdrawal. But if you conduct a fighting withdrawal and you do it under order, you preserve your forces. And so every time the Russians get past a line, then they have to again get into this expensive situation to where they expend a lot of troops going over open ground. That's how the defense should have been conducted, but instead it wasn't. They literally waited until the last few buildings. The Russians ended up prying it out of the hands of the last couple of buildings out of the hands of the Russians, the Ukrainians, sorry. And then that continued on forward. And then, of course, the same thing with Avdiivka. That was the big city that had a similar situation. Let's see, I may have gotten in the wrong spot at the moment here. But that was, you may remember, that was one of the other big ones that was pretty much right on the heels of the Bakhmut fight. And then they went on and they started getting into Chasiv Yar and then Toretsk. That's one of the other ones I want to talk about. You may recall also that I said here about a week it was more about a month ago, where I said that there had been a counterattack in Toretsk, because initially Russians took Toretsk earlier this year, and then there was a counterattack. And I said, yeah, I'm sure that they can have some success here, but that turned out to be a short-lived, as it was doomed to do so. Gary, if you can, let's see, let me go back to the screen here. Gary, if you could put that full screen up there of the Toretsk operation that one of the Forbes one. Yeah. This was defying Trump. Ukraine troops advance in the east. And they're saying, Trump had been saying since he had been inaugurated that, that the Ukraine side was spent, that they're a spent force. And so to show in the media, and Forbes was very happy to play their role, they said, no, they're on the offensive side. They're taking it to them. Well, now then you can see from that map I just showed you that the Ukraine side did take it. So after showing you before where the Toretsk was back they had taken some of this area here, this red area here. This is today, folks. This is just today. This was yellow just a couple of days ago. But now then, just exactly as I predicted it would happen, the Russians have retaken it. So the Ukraine side used what the limited offensive force they had, and then they have lost that again. So the second time they have lost that part of Toretsk. You have to keep asking, what is the point of this? What is it that they're trying to accomplish? Because I don't know what they're trying to accomplish, but what they are accomplishing is losing their troops faster. When you go on an offensive like that, as the Russians have certainly experienced, when you are going on an offense into a defensive position that's dug in by the enemy, it's very expensive to pry them out. And so, but it's also the stronger position. Defense is the stronger position, as the Russians proved in the year 2023 when the Ukraine side tried this offensive. They went into the strongest position. They dug good defensive, and they made it very expensive for the Ukraine side to attack. You may recall, I won't go through all the map now, but that's the way the Russian defense was set up in these belts, these 5 belts, so that as Russia or as Ukraine side penetrated one belt, the ideal was then before they had it fully penetrated, then the Russians would redeploy back to the next line, so that now once Ukraine got through it, then they would be back in the open. The Russians did set up their defense that way, and it worked textbook. It worked brilliantly because the Ukraine side never got through the first line for quite a number of reasons. But even if they had, the Russians had a system to be able to take it down. You also saw the Russians early in the war. They had an opportunity. They had taken the city of Kherson, one of the bigger cities, and they chose to surrender that when it came under pressure. They did what I recommended the Ukraine side did, but refused to do. They calculated that it would be too expensive to continue to reinforce that city because they had a lot of the bridges had been damaged, many had been destroyed, and it was going to be hard to hold on to it against an onslaught of the Ukraine side, and they were willing to put a lot of pressure on it. Russia took their, I think it was like 40,000 troops. They withdrew under order. They blew all the rest of the bridges over the Dnieper River on their other side, and they sealed off that further advance from the Ukraine side so they wouldn't go any further, and they saved all of those experienced troops. And then they ended up using them to build up other formations too, and they benefited from that. So that shows that a tactical retreat can turn out to be a strategic game changer, and that's exactly how it turned out here. And, you know, one of the other ones, I do want to talk about one other one, a place called Kharkiv. It was on the Dnieper River. At the end of the 2023 offensive, a lot of people were saying that, obviously, us being one of them, that the Ukraine side had lost the offensive there. It had been a complete and utter failure. And Forbes magazine again covered this. David Axman, they said, under the cover of drones and helicopters, the Ukrainian Marine Corps is advancing and expanding the Dnipro bridgehead. But I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the map one more time because there is something I want to show you here. Why this was always crazy. It's a terrible thing to do, and it should have been self-evident. Let me run back this part of the map. It's down here all the way to the bottom in Zaporizhia area. So the Kharkiv area was didn't quite go far enough. My apologies. So this is the Kharkiv. So this is the end of the part of Ukraine that Russia had captured. The offensive had stalled pretty much in this area right here, and then Ukraine said they're going to try another one, and so they went across the bridge at a place called Kharkiv, right around in this area here. I believe it's right here. Let me zoom in a little bit further right there so I can, it's right this way. So in this area here, this was a big river, the Dnieper River, which had been turned into a small river and kind of some bog areas because a bridge and a dam had been broke early in the war. And so the Ukraine side got a lot of boats, and they crossed into the Russian-held side of the river, a place that's Kharkiv. And there was a long battle here. And what I tried to tell anyone who would listen was, listen, the reason why the 2023 summer offensive failed is because even though they got up to the first line of Russian defense, they didn't have the capacity to be able to have the air power to be able to sustain the addition of new forces. They didn't have additional forces. They didn't have the engineering assets, and they didn't have the air power or air defense to be able to succeed in an offensive. Now, this is just on the southern edge of it here. So their original operation, you may recall, was to go down to the Azov coast and cut the land bridge. But now here they were trying in this area right around it here, and you can see that this is absolutely wide open. It's flat terrain. So it was always clear that even though they had this bridgehead on the Russian side of the river, there's nothing they could do with it. But they fought this, folks, for months. They just continue to put troop after troop. And again, they bragged about, how they were putting up all this defense and causing all this trouble for the Russian side. And then they ended up doing nothing. And I just never understood why they did that. And the problem is they don't seem to ever learn the lessons. These things just keep happening. And so now then you see it's continuing to this day with this attack into Belgorod. And listen to me, every time the Ukraine side does this, their force structure gets weaker and weaker and weaker. You take the guys that are trained enough to know how to do an offensive operation, and you keep sacrificing them. Instead of the strongest form of warfare, which is a solid defensive line, You're making it, you're taking the higher casualty producing actions of taking all these offensives, which have no possibility of turning the tide operationally. You may have a tactical success in the Kursk area for 7 months, but that had nothing to do with the winning the war at the operational level. And now then that's been validated again. And again, this is not some kind of brilliant ideas that I have, or I can see things none other can. This is standard military art, folks. This is common. I was trained in this as a second lieutenant. I mean, this is just part of normal military history and understanding the operational art of war, the tactics, strategic, etc. Have to do this. It shouldn't be hard. Anybody who's done any kind of study of this should have known all those things from the beginning. And the fact that either they just were ignored and didn't care, or they didn't know, I don't know, but we're seeing validated and proven on the battlefield that the Russian side seems to have learned lessons after some extremely painful mistakes that they had. I mean, I could probably do a whole show and talk about a lot of the tactical and operational mistakes the Russians made in the first year of the war. It was just terrible. A lot of unforced errors, but like the Russians have done many times throughout the centuries, they learned from their mistakes and then they came back stronger. And that's what they're in the process of doing right here. Now, all of this has a lot of ramifications for where this war is going next, because the Western side, the Western Europe, Ukraine, and many in the United States, they say, hey, we still want Ukraine to get a good deal. And we need to just put enough pressure on the Russian side to make Putin, as many say in the West, realize he can't win the war by force. And so he has to come to the table and make some kind of concessions to get a war over. But does he? Does Putin have to make concessions? I argue the most likely scenario is that Putin recognizes everything that I have just said here, that the limited amount of ammunition and weapons that the Ukraine side can get from all the sources is insufficient to win a war of attrition. That further, their own capabilities, their own generals and their own leaders are poor at the operational art, and that the Russian side are adequate. I won't say they're great, but they're robust, and in some cases they're very good. I think that this operation in the Kursk area was quite well done at the operational level. We'll see what happens if they do continue on into Sumy. But you see that Russia's putting pressure also in there's new operations in the Zaporizhia area. Just in the last week or so, there's been some new offensive operations in the south. There's continuing to be pressure in the Pokrovsk area, though that has slowed quite a bit. More in the Kupiansk area in the upper right-hand corner. Now there's some evidence that there may be some additional offensive operations in the Kharkiv area. And then now, as I just mentioned there, in the Sumy area and possibly even the Chernihiv area further to the west than that. Everywhere you look, Russia is putting more and more tactical and operational pressure on the Ukraine side, putting more and more pressure on their forces, causing them to spread out and having to fight simultaneously in so many places, which means if there's a breakthrough in any one places, they just don't have enough operational reserves and theater reserves to be able to plug the gaps and still not sacrifice somewhere else just because there's so much pressure. I think it will be very, very difficult. I won't say impossible, but very, very difficult for the Ukraine side, for their army to continue fighting into this summer. I would say by June, it would be just a remarkable feat if they can keep it together with this kind of pressure. Vladimir Putin is definitely not going to be in a hurry to get any kind of ceasefire talks done. He doesn't have any motivation to get it done. He got this 30-day ceasefire from the infrastructure, which he probably would have liked to keep on hitting the Ukrainian infrastructure, because that makes it more difficult for them to produce ammunition and weapons domestically. But he also now doesn't have to worry about these long-range shots into his own country. And there was a few of them that were really big on some of their oil refineries of late. You may have seen some of the dramatic videos of those explosions. So he got something out of that here. But now his hands completely free in all of these other areas I just described to you. So the chances that Putin is going to be in a hurry are very low, because he's happy to let this play out. Because as I keep telling you, at some point there could be a break in this thinning of the fabric of the Ukraine armed forces. And once that happens, Russia apparently does have quite a bit of operational reserves that they could bring in mass to literally roll and drive into the interior of Ukraine. We'll see how that works out here. The best thing the West can do, the best thing the Ukraine side can do, is to make the best deal they can get right now and to give up whatever territory, whatever will satisfy the Russian side that says, yeah, if you do those things, we'll stop the war right here. We'll stop the dying. It'll be ugly. There's no good face to put on it. We long since left behind because of our unwillingness in the West to accede to reality and to take an opportunity for negotiated settlement when we actually had some cards, like in November, December 2022. We actually had an opportunity and ability to coerce the Russian side to actually make a less than ideal end of war negotiations. That was a one-time deal. It's gone forever. Now then, we're just where we are right now. So my continued hope is that President Trump will, if he needs to, coerce, compel, do whatever it needs to get Zelensky to agree to whatever terms the Russians will agree to stop fighting. Because hear me clearly, this is not a matter of Trump giving anything to Putin. Trump has nothing to give to the Russians. There's nothing that he has that they want. The only thing he can do is to agree to stop here so that the war can come to an end, and then we can go on with things of a bilateral relationship afterwards to make everybody safe on both sides of the line the rest of the way. That's where we are, folks. So the longer this goes, the more obstinate the Ukraine side gets, the more obstinate side the Western Europeans get, the more Ukraine people are going to die, and the more likelihood it is that they will be militarily defeated. That's just the way it is. And you see from all this time what I've shown you here today. Thank you very much. Appreciate you very much. That'll do it for today's Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. See you then.